Conflict can feel like an irreparable end. It can feel like terror. It can feel like an overwhelming sense of, what did I do wrong? Old attachment wounds can get pinged on the daily. So a therapist brought this issue up to me. And it was an important enough point that I wanted to share it here, because it's something we have all done. Listen carefully. Imagine you saying any of these things like, hey hon, like mornings could run so much more smoothly if we moved the cars so the one with the car seat was parked in the garage. Or, oh my gosh, I really love that color. Didn't it look so nice in that restaurant that you love? Or you see an ad or a show on TV while you guys are sitting around watching TV and say, wow, that whole thing is so interesting. That could be helpful, right? Or, oh my gosh, I love that sweater. I have been looking for one like that for a while. I think they have it at that store. Or, don't you think like maybe a potluck could be a way to save some money, right? Or even, I know, all these new boxes of stuff that came in are a nuisance, but the handyman took all the boxes out today. It just took him a quick second. Doesn't it look so much better up here? What do all those things have in common? It's the hint. You aren't coming out straight and saying, let's put the car that has the car seats in it for the kids in the garage, or I would prefer the car with the car seats is parked inside so we can get going faster in the morning. Or you aren't saying straight out, I want to paint the dining room red. You aren't saying, we need to buy this new appliance because the old one is not working well anymore. Or I want that sweater. Or it would be so much easier to have a potluck for the family dinner because I am tired. Or I need help with the boxes and I can't lift all these myself. I can't do it myself. You hint, right? It's roundabout. It's almost nudging the other person to embrace something as a good idea or showing an example of it as a good idea, but you are not asking outright because that doesn't work. And you hinting fully makes sense. It can sometimes be the only path to possibly get a need or a want or a preference heard. But there is a dark side to the hint. Many a hinter in a narcissistic relationship gets called out as passive-aggressive or as a triangulator or using non-direct communication or even being called manipulative. Raise your hand if that's happened to you in couples therapy. The tragedy of this is that people will turn to the hint as a way to communicate a basic need that requires some level of collaboration. And the hint is that attempt. But unless the therapist or any supporter does not understand narcissistic relationships or narcissistic abuse, it's not unusual for people to think that the person doing the hinting is the problem, and not seeing the problem as being the person who shames the needs, the asks, the wants of the other person in the relationship. And listen, just because we voice a need or a want, it doesn't mean it's going to be met. Adults get that. But the ability to safely voice a need, met or not, is crucial to a healthy relationship. It's just not going to be happening or permissible in a narcissistic relationship. The other issue with having to hint to communicate needs is that this hinting behavior of yours can start to generalize in places outside of the relationship. And the healthy supports and friends in your life can get burned out on it, especially if they are people who would have met or listened to your needs if you had communicated them directly. And they may view you as a hinter, as being passive or even as manipulative. And this can be devastating if you are a hinter, but it's like survival hinting. It's not that you're not at all manipulative, but it's you're more desperate to get a new air fryer that won't burn down the house, or not want to have to walk your children halfway down the block on a rainy morning because the narcissistic person needs their precious car in the garage and they may not even be leaving the house that day. The hinting can also turn into sort of a hint and fluff maneuver. You not only do not communicate the need or the want directly, but may also lean into the hinted thing as being good for the narcissistic person, something that they would like, or that would make them look good, or make their lives easier. I mean, it makes sense on several levels, because sadly, sometimes when a narcissistic person knows you want or need something, they will go out of their way to ensure that you do not get it, just to mess with you. And anyone who has ever divorced a narcissistic partner who messed with child custody, you get this. But the trick with fluffing a narcissistic person is subtlety, because no one can spot a scammer better than a scammer. And since they are so manipulative, since narcissistic people are so manipulative, if your fluffing is too heavy-handed, they are going to be onto you. And throw in there that the fluff can look to other people that the combination of you hinting and fluffing makes you the manipulative one. You also have to be aware that the triangulated hint, for example, oh, look, you know, the handyman, he just moved the boxes. It took a quick second. Doesn't it look nice? That will almost always be perceived as a dig by the narcissistic person, who likely feels shamed and compared unfavorably to someone else, even if it was the narcissistic person who kept raging about the mess of the boxes, but also wouldn't help you, and then gets angry about the handyman comparison. You may wonder, what the hell am I supposed to do? Keep paying the handyman, I guess. Because the narcissistic person is like a child living in a fairy tale movie, or a king that has a butler that feels entitled to the boxes magically being moved away, and without them being told how that happened. And the fact is, this is a legacy behavior. Anyone who grew up with a narcissistic parent learned this hinting behavior in childhood. It may have been how you communicated needs as a child, or how you watched a parent get their needs met, like the less narcissistic parent or not narcissistic parent getting their needs met. You watch that dynamic. It's part of a larger triangulated dynamic in a narcissistic family. Nothing gets asked for directly. Everything is sort of point to thing A, suggest thing B to get thing C. It's exhausting, and it's demoralizing, and it's soul depleting. And many survivors of narcissistic relationships can feel a sense of moral injury, thinking like, well, I'm being manipulative to get this need met, or complicity. We are both equally bad. I don't know how to communicate, so no wonder my needs don't get met, or I can't share what I want or hope for or need in this relationship. And there are shelves and shelves of relationship books out there that will just make a survivor of a narcissistic relationship feel worse, because you're the one who's not communicating. Relationships are 50-50. Well, actually, a narcissistic relationship is the equivalent of a needs desert, desolate, as hard to find as water. But somehow, the narcissistic people always manage to find the oasis and ensure that their needs are met through manipulation and all the other stuff. The fact is that even in a relationship, that sometimes, in any narcissistic relationship, we have to communicate needs, and we cannot do things alone, or we must have the consent or agreement or cooperation of the other person, even if it's just signing a document. The hint, which for the hinter often feels so gross, can sometimes be the only clear path without either a big fight or being gaslighted or even completely being stopped and stonewalled to just get a simple need met. And the hinting can feel painful because it sucks to recognize that your partner or your family member or whomever the narcissistic person or people in your lives are, that they don't care that you have to walk in the rain with the kids in the morning to get to the car. They don't care that cooking for a holiday dinner is exhausting when you have a full-time job. They don't care that a little help around the house by them could make a huge difference after you are doing the disproportionate share of everything. So, what's the answer to this? This isn't easy. For survivors who cannot get out of these relationships, I will often tell them, if you can't get out of this relationship or don't feel you can right now, I can promise you that there is no clear path to asking for what you need or want here. There's no way to communicate this. In some cases, you have to get their buy-in. Like I said, a signature on a legal form or something around finances. And then you can lean back into true north to take the fight when it feels important. In some cases, you keep exhausting yourself and doing more than your share because it is easier than the fight, but you don't do the hinting because there's no point. You pay attention to this dynamic and let it drive your radical acceptance and realistic expectations of what this relationship is really about. And you catch yourself before you do this with other people, where you actually could communicate your needs clearly or your wants directly without anything bad happening. But you forget that and you fall back into the hinting, or you're out of practice, or you've had to spend a lifetime hearing about how greedy and selfish and needy you are for asking for what you want. If you are planning on leaving the narcissistic relationship, also pay attention to this dynamic so you can be mindful of it when you are out of the relationship and no longer always seek out the locked back door to getting your needs communicated. This hinting dynamic can be so hardwired and implicit and unconscious that we don't recognize that we do it, but it is important that we do. Not because it's meant to shame yourself or being bad for hinting, but rather this hinting thing can leave us feeling like we are failed communicators, when in fact you aren't. There is just no path forward to asking for or communicating about needs or wants in a narcissistic relationship. Hint or not. Have any of you ever done that? Played down your accomplishments because you've been in one of these relationships and you didn't feel uncomfortable or they made fun of you or criticized for it? Drop that in the comments. It would be good for everyone to see that this is something that happens to people. But let's take this down. Let's talk about what playing down your accomplishments as sort of an idea of the fallout it is from a narcissistic relationship, but also what this does to you over time. Now, because a primary dynamic for people with narcissistic personalities is projection, okay? It's a primary defense. Narcissistic people often project their stuff onto other people. For example, the narcissist might be the person who's very attention-seeking, but they will mock or humiliate you for sharing something good that happened. You know, like you might tell people on social media or you might tell a group of friends, and then the narcissist will say to you, "Oh, always talking about yourself, aren't you? You sure do need a lot of attention, don't you?" And you'll be like, "What?" And it'll sting because you often don't do that, and you may simply have been sharing something good you were doing or some good news you got or an accomplishment, maybe even because someone asked you about it. But over time, when you are in a narcissistic relationship, because you are being accused of, I don't know, grandstanding or bragging or attention seeking, it doesn't feel good to be accused of that. So you may hold back on sharing these things about yourself. And when you are asked by someone, what's new? What's been happening? Or did you get that job you were trying to get to? What have you been doing? Did that thing take off you were working on? You may even hold back. Even if the narcissist isn't there to judge you, you may hear their voice in your head. Oh, here you go. Here comes the person who needs all the attention and everyone has to hear how great you are. You may still be hearing their loop in your head. And so you hold back and say, everything's fine. No big deal. Nothing's really going on. Many of you have watched enough of these videos to know that this is the narcissist's insecurity popping out like fireworks. They don't like it when someone else gets the attention. It may sort of highlight their own perceived deficits, and that is not a good feeling for them. So they will minimize other people to lift themselves up. And that means mocking you when you're sharing something that has actually brought you up. If you grew up like this, then this is in your emotional DNA. You may have been told by a harsh, invalidating, narcissistic parent at times that pride goeth before a fall. By the way, the narcissistic parent had no problem bragging about their stuff, but for some reason when it's you, it's pride goeth before a fall. Or something that becomes a childhood teaching on, for example, don't get too big for your britches. So, as a child in that environment, maybe just to keep yourself safe and to get your parent to like you, you learn to clip your own wings. You don't share that you did well on the spelling test, or that you hit the longest home run at school that day, or that your picture was chosen by the teacher to hang up in the classroom. You may have learned early that you cannot share your accomplishments. This is a dynamic magnified for the children who took the stereotyped role of the scapegoat in their family. The golden child is often given a little bit more free rein to share their accomplishments, or maybe the parents even want to hear the golden child's accomplishments, or the narcissistic parent may even sort of show off the golden child's accomplishments and minimize what the scapegoat has done, even when the scapegoat's doing amazing things. But if you are on the wrong side of a narcissistic parent, your accomplishments either threaten the parent, or that your accomplishments don't allow the parent to maintain a devalued view of you and maybe be able to keep upholding the golden child. So they cancel your accomplishment. Or the narcissistic parent cannot tolerate anyone else being talked about or celebrated, so they shut it down and paint a picture of you, because sharing their accomplishment, the home run, the picture, whatever good moment you had, and they'll paint a picture of you as a selfish, prideful, braggy child and chastise you for it. A child under those circumstances will likely shut down their own voice and stop sharing rather than to confront the parent. This is a terrible legacy of a childhood with a narcissistic parent, because going into adulthood, you don't know how to communicate your own value. You don't go for it and reach higher. You don't know how to communicate your own accomplishments, and you might feel clumsy and awkward when you do so, and as though you're being judged. And this plays out in adult relationships as well. The adult partner who does the same thing and mocks you for sharing about yourself. Your partner saying something like, oh, here they go again, yammering on about themselves. Oh, you just are addicted to listening to you talk about you, aren't you? And you're like, what? If that happens more than once, you stop. It's embarrassing to hear that, especially when they do it in front of other people. And over time, you just stop sharing what is going on. There's no point. It hurts too much. It feels degrading. And so you hold back. This can play out in a workplace too, especially if you have narcissistic and insecure colleagues or a narcissistic boss. They may take umbrage at you getting recognition or getting credit. They may be uncomfortable about you being the one who is recognized. And you may find yourself having to defend yourself or share credit even when the other person didn't deserve it, just to survive in that kind of workplace. You may even be cut out when credit is due, or cut out of projects that are more important and that will bring more acclaim and esteem to that particular employment setting. You may also start not sharing your accomplishments at work and hold back on sharing so you aren't in the firing lines of your colleagues' jealousy. Narcissistic bosses often create these triangulated workplaces where people don't even know if it's safe to share or not, and it creates a lot of workplace jealousy. Now, at one level, there is sense in not sharing your accomplishments and anything good that's happening in your life, or honestly, anything that's happening in your life in front of the narcissist. They're just going to invalidate, especially the good things that happen to you, and it doesn't feel good. But there is another piece of fallout you may not even think about. By constantly feeling that you need to censor how you share your accomplishments or you share the good things in your life with the narcissist or when they're around, you may just actually stop learning to advocate for yourself overall. Meaning that this holding back on sharing accomplishments for fear of being criticized, or fear of being criticized for being a grandstander or attention seeking or being insecure, so you keep talking about yourself, means that you don't share anymore about what's good about what you do in any way. And that's actually a problem, because it means that you may lose the opportunity to advocate for yourself, maybe in the workplace in terms of getting a raise, or you may not really be able to capitalize on an opportunity that would allow you to network, or even to be able to do right by people you work with. I don't know, for example, if you're a teacher and you tend to hold back on sharing what's good about you, you may not be as likely to extol the virtues of your classroom or your students and position them for opportunities. There is a downstream effect. When you start silencing yourself, you silence the other people in a way who benefit from you. To be in a relationship with a narcissist is to lose your voice. In an age when one of the mantras of the past year, and we all heard it once, is, hey, I can't hear you, you're muted. Being muted is life for a person in a relationship with a narcissist. Zoom just elevated that. But you've been muted long before any of the pandemic happened. You're always muted. You decide it isn't worth the fallout, so you keep your mouth shut. And then you just keep your mouth shut everywhere, not just in front of the narcissist, but everywhere, because it feels naturally self-protective. But it does hold you back. And in fact, not only do you lose your voice in terms of advocating for yourself, you also lose your ability to even hear compliments in a way that you actually accept them kind of graciously. You're like, yeah, no, that's not true, instead of, thank you. It's as though somebody putting the spotlight on you is too uncomfortable. You keep hearing that narcissist voice. Why do you need so much attention? And even if the narcissist is out of your life, you may still struggle with hearing those compliments, as though the ghost of the narcissist is still perched on your shoulder, and you continue to doubt yourself. So one thing I would say is that, this is it's an absolutely terrible fallout of being in a relationship with, or being raised by a narcissist. Any form of narcissistic relationship tends to have this fallout. Their insecurity takes away your voice. But don't forget the other mantra of the past year, which is unmute yourself. It's really time you did. And another final piece to keep in mind is that sometimes people will actually, initially in a relationship with a narcissist, especially when the devaluing and discarding phases begin, they may come and say, hey, I want to tell you this wonderful thing that somebody told me at work today, or hey, I got to tell you this compliment I got today wherever, in the grocery store or something. Sometimes people will do that when they're in a narcissistic relationship because they know the narcissist is no longer noticing them. But if they can show the narcissist that other people out there think of you as great, that maybe the narcissist will say, oh, if other people think my partner's great, then I will start thinking my partner's great. So what happens is it's sometimes almost a strange trap. You so want your narcissistic partner or family member, even as a kid you might have done this, to notice you and see the good things that you are, that instead of saying to them, hey, I got this award today, you'll say, hey, my boss told me this person told me that, my teacher told me that, thinking like, ooh, the narcissist may not like you, but they'll take other people's regard. And in so doing, you may be somebody who's talking about all these good things about yourself, and that actually opens the portal of the narcissist starting to criticize you for being too attention-seeking. They tend to do it more in a crowd, but by and large, narcissism is really often about silencing the voices of others. A major source of shame in the narcissistic relationship is that we will look back at the relationship and recognize that in order to make it work, repeatedly, we often had to give in to them. Ultimately, it felt like we would agree to them and we would do the unreasonable things that they asked, and slowly it would feel like we gave up on ourselves if we even took time to notice how we ourselves were being affected. There were reasons, though, when we look back. We might have done all this to avoid a fight because we thought that if we pushed it, that we were being selfish, or that we were the problem, or because we're simply too tired, or because it just brought up this vague sense of fear. But not everyone who gives in feels ashamed. What's the difference between these groups? The challenge is that there are two sort of mechanisms in terms of how this happens that we give in. So one is sort of a sympathetic nervous system response. It's that list of fight, flight, fawn, freeze, submit. Involuntary responses that kick in when we experience a sense of threat. And it may be a felt sense of threat because we hold it somatically. There may not even be anything ostensibly happening in our environment, but something comes up and it may resemble something from your past. And lots of people who've experienced narcissistic abuse, especially since childhood, may experience the fawn response, that sort of involuntary pleasing, appeasing, capitulating, relenting, modifying ourselves response that most of us who fawn have looked at over the years with a sense of shame, a sense that we were somehow complicit, we were enablers, we were emboldeners, and we made it worse with our involuntary swoon, or at the very minimum with just agreeing and going along. It's not quite the silence of the freeze, nor the absolute capitulation of the submit, or even the mild dissociation of the flight. But it's a response that could range from seductive to playful to soothing to pleasing. It depends on the situation. But it was involuntary. You were not doing this on purpose. Sympathetic responses exist to keep us safe and are evoked when we feel like we're at risk or a threat. The fawn response in many ways is quite what we call prosocial. It's not that anger or frustrated fight response, like I said, nor is it that dissociated flight response. It allows us to maintain an attachment to the narcissistic person and fosters a sort of safety in that relationship. It allows it to sustain. But I cannot put too fine a point on it. This is involuntary. It's not manipulative. It's not intentional. Okay, it is involuntary. It happens to keep you safe. And it has worked in the past. So your nervous system is going to, the reflexive responses, it's going to do it again. But that's not all of it. What about the subgroup that also gives in a good-natured way, but doesn't feel shame? What's their story? These are what I can only term narcissistic tacticians. This group, they're as close to relatively narcissist immune as they come. Every so often I meet these people and they absolutely fascinate me. The people who have the sort of mastered the narcissist, and more importantly, they're not bothered by them. They don't dismiss, they're not enablers, they're not in denial. They don't dismiss the idea that the narcissistic people are narcissistic, or that even that they're causing other people pain. In other words, like I said, they're not minimizers, they're not deniers, they're not enablers. They know the narcissistic people are a problem. They themselves are just not bothered by them. And what they have figured out is how to keep the trains running on time. They sort of, these people who have this skill, I guess, they sort of good-naturedly say, sure, yep, you're right, all good. Yeah, you're right, this Chardonnay, it's great, let's get it. and or say, yep, let's just do it. You've done deals like this before. If you were to take this person aside later, they will whisper to you and say, of course they aren't right. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. That Chardonnay they picked was toilet water. And I know they're going to screw up this deal. So they kind of give in, but it's voluntary. It's not a fawn. It's tactical. In some cases, it may be done to save time, to save a headache, to avoid a scene, or often because they just can't be bothered. When I talk to these folks, and there's not a lot of them out there, they will say things like, this person is a waste of time. They're going to do it their own way anyhow. Or they might say, I stopped doing business with them a long time ago. They can make their own messes now. Or they'll say, I see them every so often. I nurse the crappy wine. It's not worth the headache to take them on. Or they'll say they're just stupid. But fighting with them puts my mom and sister on edge, and I don't want to rattle my mom and sister. In some cases, this tactical sort of immune group may call the narcissistic person out, and they're not scared of the blowback. They will be willing to call BS on the narcissistic person. And because these sorts of immune tactical people aren't scared of the narcissistic person's rage, they will not be rattled the same way if the narcissistic person screams at them. And in a weird way, they start earning some grudging respect from the narcissistic person. That doesn't mean that the narcissistic person doesn't act like an a-hole with them. They do. But in this case, it's a fair fight. So you might be wondering, who are these people and how can I become one of them? Well, this group often has some advantages. First of all, they may not have had a really bad history of narcissistic abuse in the past. They may have had some history of it. And if they did have a history of it, and even if it was pretty bad, they were able to get out of it. For example, they were able to move away and wouldn't have to have as much to do with the narcissistic person anymore. But they tend not to experience a severe soul-sapping, destabilizing, long-term version of it. Second, people with this sort of superpower may have societal power. By that I mean they may not be an ethnic minority group member. They're typically men, but not always. I've met a few white women who are like this, but in all cases, they were often very educated and also had a fair amount of money. So there's some resource there. These are folks that may not have any other vulnerabilities or organizations in society that hold them back as a whole, meaning that they may get respect and be heard in other settings in their life. Third, they may not have inflated egos, but rather healthy egos. They know who they are, but they don't need to prove it to someone else, least of all to a narcissist. Fourth, they do have empathy. They know that getting into it with the narcissistic person may make things more difficult for someone else, so they won't do it for that reason because they don't want someone else to get hurt. Fifth, they may not have other significant psychiatric or psychological patterns or things going on that would make navigating these relationships more difficult. Their anxiety is maintained at a normal level. They tend not to be depressed. They tend not to have post-traumatic sequelae or other patterns that are often associated with the hypervigilant, quicker, safety-oriented sympathetic nervous system responses or the vigilance that people may have developed in other harmful relationships. This also may be a group that has been through a hell of a lot of therapy. Some people critique this group. They'll say, well, if they have this kind of power and they could take on the narcissistic person, shouldn't they? In the spirit of protecting others? Why? The narcissistic person is not going to learn from anyone taking them on, and in fact, may rage even more at the more vulnerable people around them who the narcissistic immune person or the tactical person is trying to protect. People who are, again, more tactical like this can actually really be good, what I call middle people, right? A sort of a fixer. That's the barrier between the narcissistic person and other people. For example, is a layer between a narcissistic boss and the people who work for him, or a layer between a narcissistic parent and a grandparent and others in the family. This is a person that doesn't get affected as much by the narcissistic person's BS in the same way, and is more, again, more willing to call them out, which means that they may be able, again, as this in this middle zone, to protect the people who aren't as immune or don't have as much power. For example, in an employment setting where the narcissistic person is not leaving the job, nor are they getting fired, or in a family situation, this sort of immune middle person can be helpful. But can we cultivate any of this in ourselves? It's tricky. You can't just jump here. You maybe need to do trauma work, get to true radical acceptance, get to a place in your life where there's no real dependency on the narcissistic person or the enabling universe around them. In a way, individuation and autonomy can make this possible, as can a very good sense of humor, being agreeable, zero fragile ego. I mean, it really does require a certain kind of personality. Because there is a difference between the person who tactically gives in to the narcissistic person so as to not waste time, who sees it clearly and isn't gaslighting anybody, and the survival-oriented fawn response that many people have towards the narcissist. The person who does this tactically typically feels no shame. They may actually feel quite sad and hurt for the people being harmed, but shame, no. While most of us are probably never going to get to this full tactical narcissistic immunity, here's hoping that we can at least get into a place where we can become more tactical, if for no other reason than to save some time. When you have been through narcissistic relationships, conflict, differences can feel catastrophic. The implicit message when you've been through these relationships is that if there's a fight or an argument, then all hell will break loose. And you also learn that if you stand your ground in a conflict and you expect reciprocal accountability, then you will either A, face even more rage, B, be gaslighted and told that you are demanding, C, face the silent treatment or withdrawal, or D, all of the above. And sadly, D is usually the right answer. Tension is a constant presence in a narcissistic relationship. There is that sense that the narcissistic person can blow or get up and leave at any time. Their hypersensitivity, the suspiciousness, the provocability, the constant monitoring of threat. It always feels, like I said, these relationships and the narcissistic person can blow. This is the origin of the walking on eggshells hypervigilance dynamic of every narcissistic relationship. In essence, we hold our breath for the period of most of these relationships and wonder why our bodies are falling apart. Every child that grows up with a narcissistic parent endures this, wanting to avoid pissing off or setting off the parent. And the message when you grow up in a narcissistic household is that conflict is to be avoided at all costs. And this is no different in an adult narcissistic relationship, where conflict is always wound up, coiled up, ready and waiting to happen. In fact, the collapse and the deflation of survivors in these relationships can often mean that the conflict slows down because you are either too exhausted or too demoralized to take on the fight. Listen, not all conflict is bad conflict. Conflict is an integral part of human relationships. We are not always going to agree. In a healthy relationship with two healthy or even two healthy adjacent people, there may be some heated words, but then there can be accountability, meaningful apologies, a willingness to reflect on what unfolded, and then a commitment to getting it right, to tightening up communication. It's not punitive and silent treatment-y and grudge holding for a long time. All of us have attachment wounds. And if you don't have any, you probably aren't watching this channel. And in conflict, those wounds can get activated. The anxiously attached folks out there, you can get quite triggered and fearful during conflict, afraid of abandonment, and may hold on tight and really want to get to resolution quicker than the other person. All of us avoidant folks, you may have a bit of the F you approach and hole up for a minute and go a little silent. But, and this is the but, you can snap out of it. And after the initial nervous system responses pass, can have a repairing conversation and process because you value the relationship. You can be accountable and even be vulnerable. Our attachment wounds don't damn us in conflict. Narcissism, however, does. For a narcissistic person, there are not two sides. There is their side, and then there is the wrong side. That's you. The combination, not just of the attachment stuff, but then the self-righteous indignation, the grandiose and self-protective defenses, the lack of self-awareness, the how dare you exert yourself as a separate human being, the entitlement, the incapacity to have empathy for another point of view that they don't agree with, means that conflict is not only deeply unhealthy, but that there is often no clear way of repairing and restoring after the conflicts. Listen, narcissistic people can issue pseudo apologies. Remember the good old, I am sorry you feel that way. And they can even pretend to extend olive branches, which you have to accept on their schedule. If they're handing you the olive branch, you have no choice. You got to take it, or you're the one who's holding a grudge. Narcissistic people can also throw a rageful, explosive tantrum during an argument or say relatively unforgivable things about you, and the next day almost act like it didn't happen, or that you are making a big deal by bringing it up and you're the one with the problem because you can't let it go. So the repairs aren't really repairs. They are the equivalent of putting duct tape on a broken window. The window is still broken. This lack of repair is why the narcissistic relationship gets less and less healthy over time. Again, there can be fake repair, ignoring what happened, you taking the blame, them giving you a BS apology, you never bringing anything up, ignoring the ongoing, ever-growing elephant in the room. But that isn't really repair. That's just pretending that everything is fine. So over time, the relationship feels less and less safe, more and more hollow, less and less real, and you feel more and more disconnected. It dies a slow death because it cannot be repaired. You can't just duct tape everything. Over time, it will fall apart. Being in narcissistic relationships can give us a distorted sense of what conflict and repair mean. Conflict can feel like an irreparable end. It can feel like terror. It can feel like an overwhelming sense of, what did I do wrong? Old attachment wounds can get pinged on the daily in a narcissistic relationship because of that fear of conflict. And sadly, it can bleed into other relationships, including those that can be repaired. Not all relationships are unrepairable. In fact, conflict can be the point at which a relationship blossoms and grows and expands and levels up. It's where trust can build, not just in the other person, but in ourselves. But the fear of conflict that grows out of narcissistic relationships means that if you are a survivor, you may feel that you aren't good at conflict. The greatest risk for folks who are survivors of narcissistic relationships, especially childhood relationships, is the tendency to quickly take the blame to keep the relationship going. Narcissistic relationships program us to do that. By taking the blame, we can go back to the trauma-bonded structure, and the narcissistic person is willing to have us take the blame. So our go-to in conflict is to take the blame, to accept their inane apology, if there even is one, to avoid any topics that could bring conflict up, to never ask for accountability, to never even think accountability is possible, and to shrink ourselves to make it work. As a survivor of one of these relationships, conflict can be very unsettling, but we have to learn how to do it, or as people call it now, having difficult conversations. In many ways, having these so-called difficult conversations or conflict is the equivalent of going into the proverbial tiger's cage. You can learn a lot about how a person is built by watching how they take on conflict. Are you ultimately able to get to a place that it's balanced and you feel heard? And in some conflicts, it may not come to a perfect ending. But frankly, if you feel safe, connected, heard, and seen after a conflict, that's a big part of repair. What is not repair is you forever taking the blame, the other person forever holding a grudge, the ongoing rhetoric that you are somehow the difficult one for wanting to work through conflicts. Narcissistic people would rather just fight the fight or give you the silent treatment in the way they want. But they don't want, nor do I think are they able, to have a balanced, difficult conversation. They just want to throw a tantrum, have you feel bad, and then behave as though you are the problem. Listen, none of us are perfect during an argument. Our human tendency is to defend ourselves or to shut down. And this can be even more significant if we have histories of relational trauma, narcissistic family systems, or other forms of abuse. But if we are not antagonistic or narcissistic, we can do the vulnerable work of accountability and level up our relationships. It may take a minute, but in our relationships, if we let it breathe and watch how it unfolds, that gives us the data we need to know what this relationship is really about. Relational ruptures can be repaired. Say that a few times fast. Maybe not in narcissistic or antagonistic relationships, but in many others. And when you see the difference, you get it. Repair is possible. And when you recognize that that's actually oftentimes a tilt point between antagonistic relationships and healthy relationships, it'll give you faith in what can happen when conflict is repaired and the relationship can move forward in a more trusting direction. Thanks again.